It began with a miracle, one so extraordinary that economists around the world called it impossible. In less than 3 decades, Japan rose from the ashes of total war to become the second largest economy on Earth. Cities that had once been flattened by bombers glittered with neon and ambition. Japanese cars filled American highways, Japanese electronics filled American homes, and Japanese investors bought American landmarks. By the 1980s, many believed Japan had discovered the secret to endless growth, an economy without recessions, where cooperation replaced conflict and savings replaced speculation. But the miracle would not last. Within a decade, the same forces that had fueled Japan's rise would drag it into one of the longest stagnations in modern history. The mystery was not how Japan grew so fast, but how it stopped. The story begins in 1945, when Japan lay in ruins. Its cities were burned, its industries shattered, and its people starving. Yet from this devastation, a new foundation was built. Under U.S. occupation, General Douglas MacArthur oversaw sweeping reforms. Land redistribution broke up the old landlord class. Labor rights empowered workers, and the zaibatsu, Japan's pre-war industrial conglomerates, were dismantled into smaller corporate groups. At the same time, the United States, fearing communist expansion, poured money and expertise into rebuilding Japan as a capitalist stronghold in Asia. The Korean War, just 5 years later, supercharged this recovery. Japan became the repair shop of the American military machine, exporting machinery, textiles, and steel. By the 1950s, Japan's factories were humming again. But what made Japan's recovery different was not just foreign aid, it was structure. The government, through the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, took direct control of industrial policy. Instead of letting markets decide, bureaucrats guided capital toward strategic industries, first textiles, then steel, then automobiles and electronics. Banks, many of them connected to corporate groups known as keiretsu, lent generously under government direction. Wages were kept moderate, unions were cooperative, and companies offered lifetime employment in return for loyalty. It was capitalism, but not the Western kind. It was a hybrid, disciplined, state-guided, and obsessed with long-term stability over short-term profit. By the 1960s, the results were breathtaking. Japan's GDP grew at an average of 10% per year. High-speed rail linked its cities. Tokyo's skyline rose alongside the new bullet train, the Shinkansen, a symbol of national pride and progress. Exports boomed. Cars from Toyota and Nissan, televisions from Sony and Panasonic, steel and semiconductors that rivaled the West's best. The Made in Japan label, once a mark of cheap imitation, became a global standard of quality. By 1968, Japan had surpassed West Germany to become the world's second-largest economy. Economists called it the Japanese miracle. To the Japanese, it was more than economics. It was redemption. Behind this success lay a delicate balance. High savings rates fueled investment. A weak yen made exports competitive. Tight cooperation between government, banks, and industry ensured stability. But this same structure, so effective in growth, carried hidden fragility. The focus on exports made Japan vulnerable to global shocks. The dependence on coordination meant inefficiency and complacency could go unpunished. When the oil crises of the 1970s hit, Japan's industrial machine wavered, but it adapted with discipline, shifting toward high-tech manufacturing and fuel efficiency. The West admired Japan's resilience and envied its model. Books proclaimed that Japan is number one. By the 1980s, Japanese corporations were buying everything from Hollywood studios to Rockefeller Center. The yen's rise after the 1985 Plaza Accord made Japan's currency stronger and its investors richer. On paper, Japan seemed unstoppable, but underneath the glamour, the seeds of stagnation were already germinating. Easy money, low interest rates, and a cultural obsession with land and status created a speculative fever. Real estate and stock prices began to rise at a pace no economy could sustain. By 1989, the Nikkei stock index had tripled in just 4 years. Tokyo's Imperial Palace grounds were said to be worth more than all the land in California. Bankers lent freely against soaring collateral. Companies borrowed not to invest, but to speculate. Even households joined the frenzy, convinced that land could never fall in value. It was a bubble of confidence, built on the same faith that had once built factories. Then, in late 1989, the Bank of Japan raised interest rates to cool speculation. The spell broke. Stock prices crashed first, then real estate. Trillions of dollars in paper wealth evaporated. Banks were left with bad loans. Companies were saddled with debt they could not repay. Yet few went bankrupt. The government and banks kept them alive, afraid of the social chaos that mass failure would bring. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow suffocation. Economic growth vanished, replaced by years of stagnation that economists would later call the lost decade. Except it didn't last 10 years. It lasted more than 30. By the 1990s, deflation had taken hold. Prices stopped rising, wages stagnated, and consumers stopped spending. With interest rates near zero, monetary policy lost its power. The government launched massive stimulus packages, building highways, bridges, and public works projects, but demand never truly revived. Banks, paralyzed by bad loans, kept lending to unproductive firms, the so-called zombie companies. The once proud corporate titans that had conquered global markets now struggled to survive in a shrinking domestic economy. Japan's population began to age rapidly, its birth rate falling below replacement levels. The miracle had become a memory. What made Japan's stagnation unique was its quietness. There was no great crash, no revolution, no mass unemployment. The country remained wealthy, orderly, and technologically advanced. But beneath the surface, dynamism faded. Young people entered a job market with fewer opportunities. Wages flatlined. Innovation slowed. A culture of risk aversion took root. The same system that had once valued stability now punished initiative. The government's debt, meanwhile, exploded, reaching over 200% of GDP, the highest in the developed world. It kept the economy afloat, but only barely. Japan had traded crisis for paralysis. Over time, the rest of the world forgot that Japan's miracle had turned to stagnation. Yet the lessons never disappeared, and they became more relevant with each passing decade. The United States, Europe, and now China have all experienced their own versions of Japan's trajectory: rapid growth, asset bubbles, and the long shadow of debt. In the 2008 financial crisis, Western central banks adopted the same policies Japan pioneered: zero interest rates, quantitative easing, and endless stimulus. They too bought time at the expense of renewal. Japan was not an exception. It was the preview. Even today, Japan stands as both a warning and a mirror. Its cities remain immaculate, its technology refined, its citizens disciplined. But the promise of boundless growth has vanished. The miracle that once defied economic gravity now reminds us that gravity always returns. Every society that builds on optimism must eventually confront limits: demographic, financial, or psychological. Japan reached those limits first. 3 lessons remain. First, prosperity built on coordination can create stability, but also complacency. When no one fails, no one changes. Second, debt and demographics are slow poisons. They don't destroy economies overnight, but they hollow them from within. And third, the belief that crises can be endlessly postponed is itself the path to stagnation. The Japanese miracle didn't die in a crash. It froze in time. If this story made you see growth differently, subscribe to Economic Collapse, because the next stagnation won't arrive with panic. It will arrive quietly in a world that still believes it's growing.